The CEO needed a fake wife for a family wedding, but no one expected her to become the spotlight of the night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It's a tale of unexpected twists and the power of first impressions. A story that begins with a simple request but takes a turn none of us could have seen coming. Let me take you to the heart of this unforgettable evening. The wedding was in full swing at the luxurious Crystal Heights estate. Guests mingled under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, their laughter and chatter filling the grand ballroom. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. A storybook event, one that any family would cherish for a lifetime. But behind the polished smiles and elegant gowns, there was a secret, a deal that had just been struck behind closed doors. Charles Montgomery, the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the country, stood at the far end of the ballroom. His gaze was fixed on the ground, his mind far away from the lavish celebration around him. To everyone else, Charles was living the dream, rich, powerful, and the proud heir to a legacy that spanned generations. But inside, he felt a quiet, aching loneliness that no amount of wealth or success could fix. He had spent years building an empire, but never a real family. His heart was still empty. As the night wore on, his family's expectations grew heavier. The pressure was mounting. His mother, with her insistent smile, had been hinting for months about his personal life. "You should settle down, Charles," she would say. "You're not getting any younger." A family wedding is the perfect time to start. Charles knew he needed to make his mother happy, but he had no intentions of jumping into a relationship or marriage for the sake of appearances. That's when he had the idea, the perfect solution to keep his family off his back. All he needed was a fake wife, just for tonight. He scanned the room, hoping for a moment of inspiration. That's when his eyes landed on someone unexpected. Sophie Carson, a young woman standing by the bar, nursing a glass of champagne. She looked out of place in this extravagant setting, dressed in a simple, elegant dress. She wasn't a guest. She was the hired help, a waitress for the event. Sophie was doing her best to blend into the background, keeping her head down and avoiding any unnecessary attention. She wasn't the type to draw the spotlight, but for some reason, Charles found himself drawn to her. Maybe it was her quiet confidence or the way she seemed to navigate the room with ease. Maybe it was because, in her presence, he didn't feel the weight of his family's expectations. Whatever it was, he knew she was the answer to his problem. He approached her, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but steady. Sophie looked up, startled by the interruption. She smiled politely, but there was a hint of unease in her eyes. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" "I need a favor," he began, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "I need a fake wife for tonight. My family, they expect me to bring someone. It's all for show, really." Sophie blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, but a fake wife?" She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. He nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, it's simple. Just act like you're my wife for a few hours, and I'll make sure you're compensated. It's all a formality for the evening. No strings attached." Sophie hesitated, her mind racing. She had no idea what to make of the situation, but she could see the desperation in Charles's eyes. The idea of playing along for a night was tempting. She could use the money. After a brief pause, she said, "All right, for one night. But that's all." Charles gave her a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you. You won't regret it." And just like that, a deal was struck. What started as a simple favor would soon turn into something neither of them could have predicted. As they walked together to meet his family, neither of them knew that this evening would be one that would change everything. For Sophie, it was just a chance to make a quick buck. For Charles, it was a way to escape the pressures of his family's expectations. But neither of them expected Sophie to steal the spotlight in a way that would leave everyone, including Charles, utterly speechless. As the evening progressed, Charles and Sophie made their way through the crowd, a sea of well-dressed individuals with radiant smiles and flowing conversation. They reached his family's VIP table, the centerpiece of the evening. His mother, impeccable in her designer gown, was the first to greet them, her gaze assessing Sophie with an obvious air of skepticism. "Charles, I didn't know you had a companion for the night," she remarked, her tone a mixture of surprise and subtle disapproval. Sophie could feel the weight of her gaze, but she smiled politely, offering a firm handshake. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery. I'm Sophie." Charles quickly stepped in, his voice smooth, attempting to ease the tension. "Sophie is a close friend. We decided to come together for tonight. It's all a bit last minute." Sophie glanced at Charles, noticing the slight tension in his jaw. His family's disapproving looks were not lost on him. He wasn't used to this kind of scrutiny, but he had made his choice, and Sophie was here now. He would make it work. The night went on, and the more Charles and Sophie interacted, the more she realized how different their worlds were. He was a CEO, surrounded by luxury and expectations, while she had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, her dreams of becoming an artist constantly deferred by reality. Yet, there was something magnetic about him, something she couldn't quite place. He was charming, yes, but there was a vulnerability hidden beneath his polished exterior. Sophie caught glimpses of it when he thought no one was watching, a brief flicker of sadness in his eyes when he spoke about his family. The evening was a whirlwind of introductions, polite conversation, and forced smiles, but all the while, Sophie felt like an outsider. Still, she kept her composure, playing her part as Charles's pretend wife. As the night wore on, Charles found himself more and more impressed by Sophie's ability to handle the situation. She wasn't fazed by the high society crowd. In fact, she navigated the evening with a grace he hadn't expected. She talked to his family with ease, charming even the most stoic of his relatives. It was as if she belonged there, and that wasn't something Charles had anticipated. As the event moved into its later stages, the spotlight was now on them. His aunt, a fierce businesswoman in her own right, had decided to make a toast. She raised her glass, and the entire room fell silent. "To family, and to Charles, who has finally brought someone special to our family gathering," she began, her eyes twinkling mischievously. "And to his lovely wife, Sophie, who I'm sure will fit right in with our little clan." The applause was immediate, but Sophie's heart raced. She hadn't been prepared for this moment. She wasn't a part of this family, not really. She was just playing a part. But her smile remained in place, her gaze meeting Charles's. He gave her a reassuring nod, silently telling her she was doing just fine. The attention turned back to the stage, where the DJ started playing a soft tune for the first dance. As couples began to sway to the music, Charles leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You're doing great," he whispered. Sophie nodded, grateful for the unexpected compliment. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel a pang of uncertainty. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to this in the first place. But now, with the night moving forward, she was starting to see how much this charade meant to Charles, and maybe even to herself. She had always dreamed of something more, of living a life filled with beauty and art. But tonight, surrounded by all this wealth, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her story than just scraping by. As the night continued, Sophie's role as Charles's wife began to feel more real than she ever imagined. What had started as a simple arrangement, a way to make his family happy, was slowly evolving into something far more complicated. For the first time that evening, Sophie let herself dream. Maybe, just maybe, this night would change everything. But as the night reached its peak, neither Charles nor Sophie could have predicted how much this evening would truly impact their lives. A simple favor, a fake marriage, was about to become the beginning of something neither of them expected. The night continued, and Charles found himself increasingly distracted. Sophie had done her job flawlessly, but something about the way she moved through the crowd, so effortlessly charming, caught his attention in a way he hadn't anticipated. He watched her laugh with his cousins, casually making small talk with his aunt, and his heart tightened. This was supposed to be temporary, a simple arrangement to quiet his family's relentless nagging. But now, as he stood across the room, he couldn't help but wonder if it was becoming more than that. Sophie had slipped into the role of his wife so naturally, and he had to admit that he hadn't expected her to shine quite like this. Charles's thoughts were interrupted when his mother, always the observant one, made her way toward him. "Charles," she began, her tone sweet but with an unmistakable edge, "I must admit, Sophie is quite impressive." "She's great," he replied, his voice a little too casual. "I think you made a good choice," his mother said, her smile slightly stretched. "It's just, I never thought you'd be the type to settle down with someone like her. She's different from the others you've been with." Her words hung in the air. Sophie wasn't the type of woman Charles had dated in the past. She wasn't polished, refined, or part of the same elite circles. She was real, grounded in a way that made her stand out in a sea of high society women. His mother's eyes narrowed, as though she were trying to analyze his every reaction. "You're not thinking of turning this into something real, are you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Charles hesitated. He hadn't thought of it that way. But now, with his mother's question lingering in the air, he began to wonder if he might be in over his head. He had never imagined a woman like Sophie, someone who was so real, so unpretentious, could have such an effect on him. He quickly dismissed the thought. This was just a temporary solution. Sophie was just a stand-in for a night. But still, the image of her laughing with his family, so effortlessly fitting in, remained in his mind. As the evening wore on, Charles found himself growing more and more frustrated. His family was pushing him for answers, and Sophie, with her grace and charm, only seemed to complicate things further. He excused himself and stepped out onto the balcony, hoping the cool night air would clear his head. He stood there, for a few minutes, looking out over the city skyline, when he heard the soft click of the door behind him. Sophie stepped outside, her eyes meeting his. She was alone, the soft rustle of her dress the only sound between them. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Charles turned to face her, surprised by the concern in her eyes. He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "I'm fine," he said, but the words felt hollow. Sophie took a step closer, her presence warm and comforting. "You've been carrying a lot tonight," she said. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know this isn't easy for you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had been pretending all evening, trying to uphold an image of perfection, trying to satisfy his family's endless expectations. But Sophie, in her quiet way, saw through all of it. She didn't just see the CEO, she saw the man behind the title, the man who was struggling to find his place in a world that demanded everything from him. "You're right," Charles admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not as easy as I thought it would be." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. Her words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within him. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. The weight of his family's expectations, the pressure of living up to their standards, all seemed to fade away. Sophie had shown him a different side of life, one that wasn't about status or appearances. It was about connection, about being seen for who you truly were, not who you were expected to be. As the evening drew to a close, Charles found himself facing a choice. He had hired Sophie for one night, to be his fake wife. But now, he couldn't help but wonder if what they had was more than just a contract. The thought of asking her to stay longer, asking her to become a real part of his life, lingered in his mind. He glanced at Sophie, who was now standing by the door, waiting for him. He knew he had to make a decision soon. But for tonight, he would simply enjoy the moment. Sophie had been his savior for this evening, but he knew she was more than just that. She was a reminder of what he had been missing, a real connection, untainted by the world of wealth and expectations. And as the music faded and the last of the guests began to leave, Charles couldn't help but feel that tonight was just the beginning of something far more significant than he had ever anticipated. The days following the wedding seemed to blur into one long whirlwind of events. But one thing was clear to Charles. Sophie was becoming more than just his temporary solution. The night of the wedding had shown him sides of her that he hadn't expected, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to their connection. It was a week later when Charles found himself walking through the bustling streets of downtown, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of Sophie. He had been in meetings all day, making decisions, talking numbers, but all he could think about was her. Her laugh, her genuine smile, the way she looked at him without judgment. He stopped in front of the cafe they had visited the day after the wedding. It was small and unassuming, the kind of place he would never have paid attention to before. But now, it held a different meaning. He pushed the door open, the familiar sound of the bell ringing above his head. Sophie was there, sitting at her usual table, a sketchbook open in front of her. She didn't see him at first, so he took a moment to watch her. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her concentration was so intense that she didn't notice the world around her. He approached slowly, clearing his throat just enough to get her attention. She looked up, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Charles, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a little surprised but filled with warmth. "I thought I might join you for a coffee," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Sophie raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in her eyes. "You don't usually go for places like this." Charles chuckled, pulling out the chair across from her. "Yeah, I guess I'm starting to appreciate the quiet moments," he said, settling into the seat. Sophie's smile softened, and she closed her sketchbook, giving him her full attention. "How's work?" she asked, genuinely interested. "Busy, as always," Charles said with a sigh. "But I've been thinking a lot about our arrangement." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, but she wasn't sure how to respond. Their conversation at the wedding had left her wondering about his intentions, but she hadn't expected him to bring it up so soon. "What about it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Charles took a deep breath, the weight of his words heavy on his chest. "I don't think it's just an arrangement anymore. I know we started this as a deal, but I can't stop thinking about you, Sophie. I want more." Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, her mind racing. She had always known that their situation was temporary, that it was never meant to last. But now, hearing him say those words, she wasn't sure what to think. "Charles, I don't know what to say," she admitted softly. "I never expected. I didn't plan for any of this." He reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "Neither did I," he confessed. "But every time I'm with you, I feel like I'm seeing things differently. You're real, Sophie, and I think I need that in my life." Sophie looked down at his hand on hers, the weight of his words sinking in. She had never felt more vulnerable in her life, but something inside her told her to trust him. "I'm not sure what the future holds," she said quietly, "but I do know that I can't keep pretending. I want to be real with you, too." The silence between them felt like it stretched on for an eternity, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with understanding. Charles squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin. "I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. I just want a chance to see where this can go. For real, Sophie." Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. This wasn't what she had expected when she agreed to be his fake wife for a night. But now, she was beginning to wonder if fate had something different in mind. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's see where this goes." As they sat there, the weight of their unspoken agreement hanging in the air, Charles felt a sense of relief wash over him. This wasn't just about a deal anymore. It was about two people who had found something real, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Sophie smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. They both had a lot to figure out, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something worth fighting for. The following weeks passed by in a blur. Charles and Sophie navigated their growing connection with caution, unsure where the line between their fake marriage and real feelings began to blur. They spent more time together, not as pretend husband and wife, but as two people getting to know each other in ways they never expected. Their routine felt almost normal: morning coffees, spontaneous dinners, long talks that stretched into the night. Sophie began to realize that Charles wasn't the cold, distant CEO she first thought he was. He had layers, like everyone else, but his were hidden behind years of family expectations and the pressure to maintain a perfect image. As for Charles, Sophie was slowly becoming more than just a temporary solution. He had hired her for one reason, but now, every moment with her felt real. It wasn't just about the contract anymore. It wasn't just about filling the role of a fake wife. He found himself drawn to her warmth, her authenticity, the way she made him laugh without even trying. The idea of asking her to be more than just a part of his life for a few months, to make this real, had crossed his mind several times. But he held back, unsure of what it would mean for both of them. Sophie, on the other hand, had learned to let down her guard, but the fear of being hurt was always present. She was falling for Charles, but she wasn't sure if he felt the same or if he was still seeing her as just a temporary fixture in his life. One evening, Charles invited Sophie to an intimate dinner at his penthouse. He wanted to discuss something important, but he hadn't yet figured out how to phrase it. He had everything planned: the best wine, a delicious meal prepared by his personal chef. But when Sophie arrived, she could see the nerves in his eyes. She greeted him with a smile, a warmth that seemed to make everything around them feel less daunting. "What's going on, Charles?" she asked as she sat down at the table. "You're acting like you've got something to confess." Charles chuckled nervously, pouring them both a glass of wine. "I guess I do, in a way," he admitted. "It's just, we've spent so much time together, and I can't keep pretending that this is just a fake marriage. I want more." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She had thought about this moment, wondered if he would ever say it, but hearing the words come from him made her nervous. "More," she repeated softly. He looked at her, his expression serious. "More? More than just pretending to be something we're not. I don't want this to end, Sophie. I don't want us to go back to being strangers, to pretending that this," he gestured between them, the space between them suddenly feeling charged, "wasn't real." Sophie stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had hoped for something like this, but hearing him say it aloud made her question everything. "But what about your family?" she asked, unsure of how to navigate the situation. "They expect perfection. They expect me to marry someone who fits their ideal." She smiled softly, trying to keep the conversation light. "I don't exactly fit that mold, do I?" He smiled back, his gaze softening. "You're more than what they expect, Sophie. You're more than I expected. I didn't think I could ever feel this way. Not like this. Not about someone like you." Sophie felt her heart flutter, but a part of her still hesitated. "I don't want to be your second choice, Charles," she said, her voice steady but vulnerable. "I don't want to just be the one you turn to when the rest of your life isn't working out." Charles reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "You're not my second choice. You're the one I've been waiting for, even if I didn't know it. This is real, Sophie. More real than anything else I've ever known." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick with unspoken emotions. Sophie looked into Charles's eyes, and for the first time, she saw the truth there. He wasn't just looking for a fake wife anymore. He was looking for someone to share his life with. And as terrifying as it was, Sophie realized she was ready to take that leap. "Okay," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Let's make this real." As they sat there in the quiet of the evening, their hearts beating in sync, both of them knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges. His family, the public's expectations, and their own fears would all play a part. But in that moment, all that mattered was that they were willing to face it together. This wasn't a contract anymore. It was a partnership, a real relationship, and for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to embrace it. As the days passed, Charles and Sophie found themselves navigating this new chapter in their relationship with a mix of excitement and apprehension. They were no longer pretending. What had started as a business arrangement had transformed into something real, something neither of them had expected. Sophie had always been cautious, and Charles was no different. But the way they fit together seemed effortless. They spent more time together outside the boundaries of business and appearances, sharing intimate moments and personal stories. Charles began to trust Sophie more, confiding in her about the pressures he faced, not just from his family, but from the relentless expectations of the world he lived in. In return, Sophie opened up about her own struggles, the years of working multiple jobs, her dream of becoming an artist, and how she had learned to fight for every inch of her success. For the first time in years, Charles felt like he was truly seen, not for his wealth or status, but for who he was inside. It was a relief, one he hadn't realized he'd needed so badly. Still, doubts lingered in the back of his mind. What would his family say? Would they ever accept Sophie as more than just a temporary solution? His mother, in particular, had been skeptical from the beginning, and even though the wedding had been a success, he could sense her growing discomfort as she realized their arrangement wasn't as temporary as he had led her to believe. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Charles sat in his office, his mind swirling. He had been debating how to approach his family, especially his mother. He knew the conversation was inevitable. He couldn't keep hiding Sophie from them forever. He reached for his phone, dialed Sophie's number, and waited. "Hey, Charles." Sophie's voice greeted him warmly. "Hey, are you free tonight? I need to talk to you about something." There was a slight pause on the other end, then a soft reply. "Of course, what's going on? Can you meet me at my place?" I think it's time we figure out how to tell my family about us. I can't keep this a secret any longer, he said, feeling the weight of his words. Sophie took a deep breath before responding. I'll be there in an hour. The uncertainty in her voice mirrored his own, but they both knew it was time to confront the truth. When Sophie arrived at his penthouse later that evening, they sat together on the couch, the air thick with tension. Charles looked at her, his hand finding hers. I've been thinking a lot about us, Sophie. About how far we've come, and how much we've shared. And I know we can't keep pretending that this is just a deal. I want you in my life, for real. But I don't know how to tell my family. Sophie squeezed his hand gently, her eyes filled with understanding. I know it's not easy. They've always had expectations of you, Charles, and now that I'm in the picture, it complicates things. But we can't let their opinions hold us back. We have to decide what we want, not what they expect from us. Charles looked down, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his glass. I just don't want to disappoint them, especially my mother. She's been pushing me for years to find the perfect woman, and I'm not sure she'll ever accept you. I don't want to lose her over this. Sophie's heart ached at his words. She understood the pressure Charles was under, but she also knew that this was about more than just his family's approval. It was about their future together. Charles, your mom may not understand right away, but that's not the most important thing. What matters is how you feel. How we feel. If this is what you want, we'll figure it out. We don't need anyone's approval to be happy. Charles nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I just wish it were easier. It will be, Sophie reassured him. But we have to take the first step. We have to be honest with them, even if it's hard. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Charles knew that Sophie was right. They couldn't keep hiding, and he couldn't keep living his life based on other people's expectations. He had to live for himself. For them. The next day, Charles arranged a family dinner at his mother's house. Sophie was nervous, but she was determined to be there, to stand by his side. As they sat down to dinner, the tension was palpable. His mother, as always, was sharp, her eyes constantly flicking between the two of them. Finally, she spoke. Charles, I have to say, I'm surprised. I didn't expect this arrangement to last. But you're still here with Sophie. What exactly is going on between you two? Charles took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Sophie's. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, and he felt a sense of calm wash over him. Mom, he began, his voice steady. This isn't just a temporary thing. Sophie and I, he paused, looking at her again. We're in this together. I care about her, and I want her in my life, for real. This isn't just a deal anymore. Sophie's heart raced as she waited for his mother's response. The silence stretched on, but she could feel the weight of the moment. Finally, his mother looked at her, her expression unreadable. I see, she said softly, her gaze softening just a little. I can't say I understand, but I can see that you're both serious about this. The conversation continued, but for the first time, Sophie felt a shift. It wasn't about convincing anyone. It was about owning their story, their future. They didn't need anyone's approval to be happy, as long as they had each other. The following weeks brought more clarity for both Charles and Sophie, but it was not without its challenges. Although Charles had finally taken the step to be honest with his family, the reality of their relationship was far from easy. His mother had reluctantly accepted the idea of Sophie, but her approval was lukewarm at best. Sophie knew this, and she also felt the pressure that came with it. She wasn't part of their world. She wasn't a polished socialite or a woman from the right circles. But as Charles insisted, they had something real. Something that no amount of wealth or family expectations could change. One evening, after another dinner at his mother's house, Sophie and Charles found themselves alone in his office. The tension in the air was thick, and neither of them had spoken much during dinner. You okay? Charles asked, his voice gentle as he watched Sophie fiddle with the edge of her glass. She looked up at him, her expression soft but troubled. I don't know, Charles, she said quietly. It feels like I'm always going to be the outsider. Your family, they don't really accept me. It's like I'm just a temporary part of your life. Charles walked over to her, kneeling beside her chair. He took her hand in his gaze steady and warm. Sophie, you're not temporary. And my family, they'll come around. It's just going to take time. But Sophie wasn't convinced. She knew how hard it would be to truly fit in. She had always felt like an outsider in wealthy circles, and even though she had Charles now, A part of her was still unsure if she could ever truly belong in that world. "I want to believe you," she said softly, "but sometimes it feels like this whole thing is a fantasy. Like it's too good to be true." Charles lifted her chin gently, his eyes locking with hers. "It's not a fantasy. It's real. And I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out, Sophie. Together." Sophie smiled, but there was still uncertainty in her heart. "But what if it's not enough? What if they never really accept me?" Charles leaned forward and kissed her forehead, his touch soft and reassuring. "Then we'll make our own family. We don't need anyone's approval but our own. We're enough, just the two of us." Sophie nodded, feeling a flicker of hope in her chest. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but Charles's words meant more than anything. The next few days were filled with both light and tension. Sophie had started to find her own place in the world, but Charles's family still loomed over them. Sophie had made a conscious decision to stop worrying so much about fitting in. She couldn't change who she was for anyone. But even as she tried to remain confident, the weight of being an outsider still lingered. Charles's family had made their feelings clear, and although they were polite to her, it was obvious that she didn't belong. His mother continued to express subtle disapproval, and his cousins would exchange knowing glances when Sophie wasn't looking. It wasn't easy, but she was determined not to let it break her. She had Charles. That was enough. One afternoon, as Sophie walked through the park near her apartment, she saw a man standing by a bench. He looked out of place, staring at the sky with a kind of sadness that struck her. It wasn't something she often saw in the busy city, and for some reason, it drew her in. She approached him slowly, unsure if she should say something. As she got closer, she noticed the tears in his eyes, and her heart softened. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice quiet. The man looked at her in surprise, his face softening when he saw her expression. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just a little lost." "Sometimes it helps to talk," Sophie said with a kind smile. "I'm Sophie." The man nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'm Mark. It's been a tough day." Sophie sat down beside him, offering him a moment of comfort. They didn't speak for a while, but the simple act of sharing space seemed to calm him. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "I've been struggling, you know. I used to have everything, but now, it feels like I've lost it all." Sophie listened patiently, her heart going out to him. "I get it," she said softly. "Life can be really tough, especially when you least expect it." They sat in silence for a while, watching the people pass by. There was something about this stranger, something that reminded her of herself before she met Charles. She had been lost too, just trying to find her way. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Mark said after a long pause. "Everything has changed, and I'm just stuck." Sophie thought about her own life and how she had fought to get where she was. "You're not stuck," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It might feel like it, but there's always a way forward. It's just about finding it." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." She smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment. They stood up together, and as they parted ways, Mark gave her a nod of thanks. Sophie watched him walk away, feeling a strange sense of peace. Maybe she couldn't change everything for him, but in that moment, she had made a difference. It reminded her of what she had with Charles, the way they had helped each other grow, the way they had found a way through their struggles together. It wasn't about fitting into some ideal mold. It was about finding someone who saw you for who you were and accepting each other despite all the imperfections. Sophie walked back to her apartment with a renewed sense of clarity. No matter what happened with Charles's family, she knew one thing. She was enough. And together, she and Charles would make it work. As the weeks went on, Charles and Sophie's relationship began to feel more genuine. But with that authenticity came new challenges. Their decision to be open with Charles's family had been a step forward, but it didn't erase the underlying tension that remained. Sophie, despite her growing bond with Charles, still found herself navigating the cold stares and subtle remarks from his relatives. It was as if they were waiting for her to fail, to prove that she didn't belong. But Sophie wasn't the type to back down, and neither was Charles. They continued to face the obstacles together, growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, Charles invited Sophie to a charity gala his company was hosting. It was an event filled with the most influential people in his industry, a night where appearances mattered more than anything else. Sophie had always felt out of place in such settings, but this time, She was determined not to let it bother her. She stood in front of the mirror in the fitting room of a high-end store, her heart racing. The dress she had chosen was beautiful, but it wasn't the kind of thing she ever wore. She could feel the weight of the evening ahead, the pressure to fit in, to prove herself. "You look stunning." Charles's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a sharp tuxedo, his expression soft as he looked her over. Sophie smiled nervously. "Do you think so?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "You're perfect," he said, stepping closer and taking her hand in his. "You belong here, Sophie, just as much as anyone else." His words, as simple as they were, meant more to her than he could ever understand. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, how much she needed to be reminded that she wasn't an outsider in his world. Together, they left the store, heading for the gala. When they arrived, the glitzy venue overwhelmed her. The guests were all impeccably dressed, each one more powerful than the next. It was a world of money, status, and influence. As they walked into the ballroom, the murmurs of the crowd seemed to hush. Sophie could feel the weight of their stares, but she refused to let it show. She walked with Charles, head held high, determined to make the most of the night. "Charles, I didn't know you'd be bringing someone like her," one of his cousins remarked, her tone dripping with condescension. "She's not quite what we expected." Sophie's heart sank at the comment, but she kept her smile intact, refusing to let the woman see how much it stung. Charles, however, didn't let it slide. "She's my partner, and she's more than enough for me," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the room. Sophie felt a surge of gratitude for him. He wasn't ashamed of her, he was proud, and that meant everything. The night went on, and as Charles introduced Sophie to various people, she started to feel a sense of belonging. It wasn't just about fitting into their world. It was about proving to herself that she could handle it, that she could stand her ground and be true to who she was, no matter where she was. As the evening progressed, Charles pulled her aside, his expression more serious now. "Sophie, I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about us, about everything." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What about us?" she asked, unsure of where the conversation was headed. Charles took a deep breath, his hand finding hers. "I think it's time to take the next step. I want to marry you, Sophie. For real, no more pretending." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but it also terrified her. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm more than sure," Charles replied, his gaze unwavering. "I want to spend my life with you, Sophie. No more secrets. No more games. I don't care about anyone else's opinion. This is about us." The weight of his words settled on her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. To believe in them. Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief that washed over Charles was palpable. He pulled her into an embrace, holding her close. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The rest of the night faded into the background as they shared a quiet moment, just the two of them. Their world, the one they had created together, was real now. They didn't need anyone's approval or validation. They had each other. The next morning, Charles and Sophie sat together in his penthouse, discussing their future. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were ready. Sophie had her own dreams, her own ambitions, and Charles was determined to support her every step of the way. Together, they would create a life that was theirs, one built on love and mutual respect. And as they made plans for their future, Sophie realized something. She wasn't just the girl who had been hired for a fake marriage. She was the woman who had found a real connection, a love that had grown out of the most unexpected of circumstances. She had found her place in Charles's world, not as an outsider, but as an equal. And that was enough. As the weeks went by, the reality of their decision began to settle in. Charles and Sophie were no longer just playing roles in each other's lives. They were partners in every sense of the word, with their own dreams, their own ambitions, and a shared commitment to build a future together. Charles had kept his promise to Sophie to make this real, and now it was time to make it official. The engagement had been a quiet moment, just between the two of them, but the next step was something they had both been anticipating. Charles had decided to take Sophie to his family's estate for a formal gathering, where he would introduce her as his fiancée to the world. It was a risky move, but he was ready. The evening of the gathering, Sophie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress, the soft rustle of the fabric filling the room. Her heart raced in her chest. It wasn't just the gathering. It was the significance of what it meant. This was the moment. Sophie was no longer an outsider. She was Charles's equal, his partner. And that meant everything to her. When Charles walked into the room, dressed in a sharp suit, he paused at the doorway, taking in the sight of Sophie. She looked radiant, her presence commanding yet graceful. He smiled, walking over to her and taking her hand in his. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with admiration. Sophie smiled back, the uncertainty in her eyes now replaced with confidence. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think I'm ready for this." The evening unfolded just as Charles had hoped. Sophie held her own, engaging with his family with grace and intelligence. She wasn't the woman they expected her to be, and that was exactly what Charles had wanted. As the night continued, he could see the subtle shift in his family's attitudes. They were no longer looking at her as a stranger, as someone who didn't belong. They were starting to see her for who she was, someone worthy of being by his side. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. After the dinner, Charles took Sophie aside, his face a mixture of pride and relief. "You did amazing tonight," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I don't think I could have asked for a better partner." Sophie looked up at him, a smile spreading across her face. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "You gave me the courage to be myself." They stood there, surrounded by the elegance of the estate, but for the first time, it felt like their world, not just Charles's. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter and conversation, but Sophie couldn't stop thinking about how far they had come. This wasn't just about a business arrangement anymore. This was a partnership built on trust, respect, and love. As the night drew to a close, they found themselves alone in the garden, the soft glow of the moon casting a gentle light over them. Charles took Sophie's hands in his expression serious. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady. "I've spent so much of my life trying to meet other people's expectations. But what we have, this, with you is real. And it's everything I've ever wanted." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, her emotions overwhelming her. She had never imagined she would find someone like Charles. Not just because of his wealth or status, but because of who he was as a person. "Charles," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I never thought I would be here. I never thought I could have this." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You deserve it. All of it." The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Sophie felt sure of one thing. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with Charles. As they stood there together, watching the stars above, Sophie realized that everything they had gone through, the struggles, the doubts, the pressure from his family, had led them to this moment. And it was worth it. Charles pulled her into his arms, and for a moment, they stood in silence, simply holding each other. The world around them seemed to disappear. They didn't need anything else. They had each other. The next day, Charles took Sophie to the city, to the small art gallery she had always dreamed of opening. It wasn't much yet, just a few sketches and ideas, but it was hers. She had always wanted to create something real, something that reflected her passions. And now, with Charles by her side, she had the opportunity to make it happen. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice filled with hope. Sophie smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. "I know," she replied, "and I'm ready for it." Together, they would build a future, a life full of love, challenges, and dreams. They had come a long way from where they started. And though there would be obstacles along the way, Sophie knew they would face them together. She wasn't just the girl who had agreed to a fake marriage. She was a woman with a future, with a partner who believed in her. And that was everything she had ever wanted.